Professional wrestling. You either view it as a wonderful male soap opera full of fake stunts and good times, or you view it as that stupid fake shit that is a detriment to television and the downfall of mankind. Welcome to the Salty Seaman, and today we're going to talk about the military gimmick in professional wrestling. Now, I have to be very honest, I've been a very long time fan of professional wrestling. I've been a fan of mixed martial arts and any boxing and any kind of combat sports, and yes, even the fake stuff. And I know there's a lot of people who have their opinions one way or the other on it, so if you're not super interested in, military gimmicks in professional wrestling, I respect that, and you can stop watching now. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about how the military gimmick has worked in professional wrestling over the last probably half century. Now, going back to at least World War II, professional wrestling, which is a work, which means it's not real, get that out of the way, uses characters to incite the audience one way or the other. So there's always been the enemy heel, the bad guy, who's often not a very good person, and is often in the military. Back post-World War II, you had a lot of fake German and Japanese military officers coming in to beat up the Americans and trying to get heat or bad guy stuff on the good guys, basically to draw attention and sell tickets and whatnot. And this has continued on through. Now, I'm not talking about anybody who says they're in an army or they're a general. There's been tons of those gimmicks. I think even Jim Cornette at one time had the Cornette Army and he wore fatigues, but he wasn't trying to pass himself off as being an actual military guy. I'm drawing the line here, especially things like him or John Cena, who kind of adopted some militaristic stuff in his gimmick after he started in the Marine and he started giving a salute and wearing army short fatigues and whatever. Now we're going to look at four basic true military gimmicks and why they worked, why they didn't. Now, start off with the basic military gimmick has two sides of it. You can go either heel or face, either good guy or bad guy. The way the heel works is you're basically the drill sergeant nasty. You're the bad guy, you're the drill sergeant, and you're out to inflict pain and do terrible things to other people. One of the ones we'll get to, one of the most famous military gimmicks of all time did both, and we'll talk about him last. And the other way you go with it is the patriotic, here is a service member defending his country kind of gimmick. And those are great too, but it's really only ever worked for one person. So it seems kind of strange because that's also a gimmick they will always try to use, especially in a nation of patriotism. We're going to support our troops. So when does the gimmick work? When doesn't it? And honestly, it doesn't work very often either way. So let's start off with a basic military gimmick. GI Bro. This was a gimmick adopted by Booker T, who became famous much later for being in Harlem Heat and by himself. He's a five-time WCW champion and a one-time WWE champion. But one of his very early gimmicks was he was playing a military guy, GI Bro, and I think it was the Global Wrestling Federation or one of those weird offshoots in the late 80s, early 90s. The problem with him was he was never actually in the military, and he was just trying to play this patriotic kind of former soldier, and the gimmick kind of went nowhere, and he had to move on to a different gimmick. And a lot of that was because people didn't buy it, and obviously he wasn't actually in the service, and they really weren't doing a lot with it. But it's an example of people trying to push off the pro-military vibe. luckily Booker T survived it, went on, and it's not really held against him. It's been used occasionally as a joke in pro wrestling in more modern times. People remind him he did this gimmick. But overall, it was an attempt to do the patriotic babyface thing. And it really didn't work. And it doesn't help when you're not actually in the service. Now we move on to our second guy here is Sergeant Pittman. He was an actual Marine. He rank of sergeant. He was actually an amateur wrestler for the Marine Corps. And his original gimmick was the Drill Sergeant Nasty gimmick. He was the guy that went in the ring and just beat the crap out of people, and he was playing up the Drill Sergeant Nasty kind of vibe of this former military guy who's just beating the crap out of people and trying to get this heel heat as this character. And it never really got over big. He turned face a couple times, but overall he's mostly remembered for being this kind of Drill Sergeant Nasty type. And despite his actual credentials and the fact that he's actually a person who could beat up in real life most of the people in the ring, given his Marine and amateur wrestling background, he never really got a big push. Part of that was, when he started wrestling, he was a bit out of shape. He was a bit flabby, and they didn't see a lot to do with him. He had a good little career in WCW as kind of lower mid-card. He did like one little run in WWE, WWF at the time, and then he went on to, he did a couple of mixed martial arts matches. He had a record of 2-2. But overall, it was an attempt to bring back the Drill Sergeant Nasty kind of gimmick, and it really didn't get over. And even in the 90s, when there was like a lull after the Gulf War and before 9/11, there really was I don't think there was any support of the military one way or the other. But no one really cared about the gimmick. No one cared about a Marine going in there and beating the crap out of people. It just didn't resonate. We go back to look to 1986 with Corporal Krochner. He was another actual military guy. He was an Army paratrooper. He became a wrestler, and once Sgt Slaughter left the WWF at the time, WWE, he was kind of tagged to be their next patriotic military guy to be this big babyface, kind of capitalizing on the patriotism going on at the time in the mid-'80s, especially with terrorism in Iran and such. Same thing Sgt Slaughter did, but he never really caught on. Part of his biggest problem was, he wasn't the greatest wrestler or talker, and he's coming on the heels of one of the biggest baby faces they ever had. So, and then he failed a drug test, and then his career was pretty much over, at least on a national scale. And it was another attempt at, we're pushing the babyface military guy, and it just didn't quite work. Now, before we go on to the main event and we talk about Sarge and his history, there's been a few people who served in the military who never got the gimmick. Now, there's various reasons why you don't go with someone's real-life exploits to be a gimmick, but there's three very prominent people in wrestling who have a military service that never was brought up while they were wrestling. First, let's look at Brian James, a.k.a. Brian Armstrong, a.k.a. the Road Dogg Jesse James. He's an actual Marine vet, served in the Gulf War, an actual combat vet. Nowhere in his career was that actually used as a gimmick. He started off in the WWF as a roadie to Jeff Jarrett, and then eventually he broke off and became one of the biggest tag teams in the world, the New Age Outlaws, part of DX, Degeneration X. And other than Jim Ross occasionally on commentating, bringing up the fact that he was a former Marine, it was never an issue, and it was never a gimmick they used, and you kind of wonder why. And because he had honorable service, he was a combat vet, but for him, pushing his actual personality, which was what got him over in DX and the New Age Outlaws, as this kind of party crazy guy, which is more of his personality than anything, they really stuck with that until basically he didn't have a career anymore. So there was never no one ever saw a chance to use this as like, you know, the Marine Jesse James or whatever. So he just kind of got left on the wayside for that gimmick, though he's very open and supportive in talking about his past in the Marines. And this brings up to another former Marine, Randy Orton, one of the biggest stars in WWE today. He is a former Marine, but the reason it's not brought up ever is he didn't have the best career. Apparently, he was booted out somewhere halfway during his tour, I believe, for being UA AWOL, and he doesn't have a very good experience with the Marines, and he's still not to this day happy about it. And even when he's a bad guy or a heel, they don't really bring it up as a detriment to him, which is a thing in pro wrestling you'll do. I think probably because he says no, because he really had such a bad experience in the Marine Corps. And funny thing is, both these guys are second or third generation wrestlers who decided to go into the military before they pursued their career in the family business. You know, one had a successful time. You know, Road Dogg even wanted to re-enlist at one point, but due to drawdowns, you know, he wanted to come back as a DI, drill instructor, but couldn't. So instead of just staying infantry for another 4 years, he decided to get out and go in the family business. And Randy Orton, of course, you know, he couldn't stay in, and he had a other than honorable discharge. I don't know exactly what his discharge is, but we assume it was not honorable. And then you have one of the biggest of all time, Jesse Ventura. It's hard to think about it now because everyone really knows the story of this guy. You know, before he was a pro wrestler, before he was a governor, before he was a talk show host talking about all these conspiracy crap, you know, he was a Navy UDT diver, part of the Bud SEALs program. And when he was a active duty wrestler, this was never brought up, mostly because he was a bad guy. Bring up the fact that he was an actual badass UDT guy wasn't really good for his gimmick, because that would give people a little bit of patriotism. Even in the 70s or 80s, people would have looked at this guy as like, oh my god, this is a real American hero. He was a guy who went and defused bombs in Southeast Asia and went through the hardest training in the world. Now, not to get sidetracked, but you know, there are people who say like, well, he claims to be a SEAL now and he was never a SEAL, he was UDT. The way the SEALs look at it, for the record, is if you went through the training, you know, it doesn't matter. Like, there was a difference of it back then. You know, they separated people who graduated BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition School, between SEAL and UDT, and eventually they all combined in the 80s. But in terms of brotherhood, they all consider anyone who's been through that training all the way back to the frogmen of World War II as SEALs, so he has the absolute right to call himself a SEAL. And if you want to disagree with that, you're not an actual SEAL, apparently. I mean, Don Shipley himself has said it on record. He's a SEAL. So, putting that aside, he is one of the more badass military guys that ever worked in professional wrestling, and it's never been a thing until he was actually out of professional wrestling, and it became more part of his gimmick as a public figure. So pretty interesting, but it was all about timing and his, you know, when he was in. Now, saying all that, we're going to the main event here, which y'all been waiting for. Of course, the most famous military gimmick in pro wrestling of all time, Sgt Slaughter, aka Bob Remus, an actual USMC veteran. He wrestled under his own name for a while, and once it was kind of discovered he was a former Marine, he actually started his gimmick as the Drill Sergeant Nasty in the 70s. This has some interesting parallels to what was going on in pop culture. This is post Vietnam War, and a hell of a lot of the audience had been conscripted or had joined the military in the draft. So this was a character that they recognized, as so many of them had been through boot camp or had a brother or a father or whoever who'd been through it, and they knew this character as this nasty, you know, mess with you, calling you maggot, all that good stuff. And you know, he rode that career as that bad guy, drill sergeant nasty character through the 70s. And then an interesting change happened in the early 80s. All of a sudden, it's patriotism is cool again. You know, we're having issues with Iran and all these other countries, and they decided to turn Sgt Slaughter into a good guy, a babyface. and he started a feud with the Iron Sheik, a real life Iranian, playing the bad guy heel, and it got so over, and his whole persona got so over. You know, he was the second biggest babyface behind Hulk Hogan at one point in 1985. However, he was also business smart and realized like he was losing a lot of money working for WWF, and he wanted to control his own gimmicks and his own merchandising, and they weren't happy with that. So after a contract dispute, he left and went on the independent circuit in wrestling. Worked for AWA, one of the bigger companies at the time, and he got over, and he still was over, and a lot of that was due to he signed a endorsement deal with G.I. Joe, which I've talked about here quite a bit, and became one of their characters. And there's not a boy in America in the 1980s who don't know who Sgt Slaughter is. If you didn't know him from wrestling, you definitely knew who he was through G.I. Joe as a character and a figure, and he was huge. Now with him, here's another funny thing. He actually came back to the WWF in the late 1989, early 1990s, and they, instead of capitalizing on like every young boy in the country knows who you are and you're a good guy, they decided for whatever reason they're going to turn him bad guy again. Initially it was just like he was, you know, upset with America and just, you know, decided to be a bad guy again. And then the first Gulf War comes along. And then the decision was decided to move him fully as a traitor and an Iraqi sympathizer. And this led up to this huge run as him as like one of the bigger heels of the era. They even brought back the Iron Sheik as Colonel Mustafa, who's suddenly not Iranian anymore, and he is an Iraqi colonel, because absolutely no one recognized the Iron Sheik from a couple of years ago, even though he's not even wearing a mask. He just has a bullshit uniform on, as you know, and a guy he feuded with for years and years. It's one of the most bullshit things in pro wrestling. It bugs me more than anything, I swear to God. But the thing was, it was just designed to get him so much heat and so much bad rep as a villain. You know, they gave him the title. He beat the Ultimate Warrior. Unfortunately, during this time, there's a real war going on. People are really dying. And see something that's escapist like pro wrestling, which is supposed to be silly and fun and simple things we can laugh and boo and cheer about, is suddenly like there's a real face on it, and there's real brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers out there, you know, facing death or dying in a real war, and this guy's defending the enemy. You know, it soured, especially from a guy who was a hero for so long, that it really turned everyone off to the gimmick. Like it didn't get over as big as it was hot for a minute, but it went away. You know, to the point where he wrestled Hulk Hogan for the title in LA, and they had to move the venue from a much larger stadium that they expected to sell out, that sold like 0 tickets almost, so they had to move to the smaller Coliseum that you know, they could, you know, actually fill a house. And they were lambasted by the pro wrestling press and the mainstream press so badly for this tasteless gimmick that eventually they went with it a few months after Hogan had beat him for the title, but they, you know, eventually they had to try to turn him back a babyface and claim he wants his country back. But I mean, the guy was essentially ruined at that point. Now a few years later they'd bring him back as a non-wrestler, and he'd work in his commission role. And time kind of heals all wounds. You know, he's now recognized as a legend. Everyone loves the Sarge. You know, there's no real issues. But there's a lesson to be learned there. Like the military gimmick in pro wrestling is a very hard thing to do. To do it right, you know, there's only, basically he's one of the guys that's ever done it really good on both sides of the fence. And you see those examples, like no one else really pulls off the military gimmick, because it either comes across as corny and fake and I don't like it, or very few times where they try the drill sergeant nasty thing. It has to be done at the right time, and Sarge is the only guy who's ever been able to capitalize on that both times as a good guy and a bad guy. So what is the lesson learned here? Is pro wrestling ever going to do more military gimmicks? there's no saying. It'll depend on the time and the pop culture. It'll depend on what we're feeling. Right now, it looks like wrestling is not overly enthused about trying that gimmick because there's just so many landmines in it. You know, there's not saying that they won't do it in the future. They've definitely pushed military in other ways. You know, WWE used to do yearly trips to the sandbox, Iraq and Afghanistan, and put on shows, you know, tribute to the troops. And a lot of that was pushed for what everyone feels is truly altruistic reasons. Vince McMahon himself, the owner, and John Bradshaw Layfield, one of the wrestlers, not a former military guy, but a huge supporter of them, are really big on putting on these shows because, by all accounts, they are truly appreciative and big supportive of the troops, and they put these things on, you know, losing money every year, not just as a PR thing, but as just as their personal thing, and that's really cool. I'm sure, and everyone appreciates that. John Cena, you know, he's just one of those guys. You know, he'll go see every Make-A-Wish kid. He'll go see every guy at Walter Reed. You know, and that's on him personally. He just seems to be one of those good guys. But in the future, I'll see the gimmick will come back at some point. You know, either as a bad guy or a good guy, depending on the time. You know, it'll be interesting to see as a pro wrestling fan, especially as a guy who just served 20 years. You know, I'm always kind of looking at those military gimmicks as like, you know, okay, let's see what you're doing with it. You know, I will suspend disbelief to be entertained, but I don't guarantee anything if you push the line. I'll definitely never take another Sgt Slaughter as an Iraqi sympathizer. I'll turn off the TV just like they did back in 1990. Anyways, if you were a fan of military and pro wrestling stuff, I hope you like this stuff. You know, just something I've been kicking around for a little while. Thought it was pretty interesting. Like and subscribe. I got tons of other military related stuff, tons of military movie bullshit on various movies and TV shows. And that's all I got for right now. I'll catch you on the flip side. Peace.